The announcement did not drift into the public conversation. It slammed into it. Canada had officially rejected Donald Trump's proposed $7 billion joint military base. And in the span of a few hours, what had been marketed as a historic leap forward in North American defense cooperation became something else entirely. A rupture, a rebuke, a geopolitical moment with consequences far beyond a single construction project. In Washington, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Officials who had treated the proposal as a near certainty suddenly found themselves recalibrating. Advisors were called in. Briefings were rewritten. The White House, which had framed the base as a bold symbol of strength and unity between two of the world's closest allies, was now grappling with a public and definitive no. In Ottawa, by contrast, the tone was steady. Canadian leadership made it clear that this was not a misunderstanding, not a temporary pause, not an invitation to renegotiate minor details. The decision was final. It was rooted in national interest. It reflected, they said, a deliberate assessment of sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and long-term defense planning. And that contrast, scramble versus resolve, told you almost everything you needed to know about how significant this moment was. The proposed base had been pitched as transformative. $7 billion is not small change in defense terms, but more than the price tag. It was the symbolism that mattered. This was supposed to represent the next phase of continental defense integration. A permanent joint installation, advanced systems, shared command structures, rapid response capabilities designed for a world increasingly defined by technological competition and unpredictable threats. For months, discussions unfolded behind closed doors. Military planners evaluated potential sites. Engineers drafted conceptual designs. Policy teams worked through questions of cost sharing, jurisdiction, operational control. Publicly, there was optimism. Privately, there were questions. And those questions, it turns out, were not trivial. In Canada, concerns surfaced early in the process. Sovereignty was at the center of the debate. Would the base operate under genuinely joint command? Or would the United States, given its scale and military weight, exercise de facto control? How would deployment decisions be made? What would happen if Washington sought to use the facility in ways that Ottawa did not fully endorse? These were not hypothetical anxieties. They were strategic considerations. Canada's defense policy has always existed in close coordination with the United States, but not in subordination to it. That distinction matters deeply in Canadian political culture. A permanent, large-scale joint base on Canadian soil inevitably raises questions about autonomy, not because cooperation is unwelcome, but because permanence changes the equation. Public sentiment played its own role. While some Canadians viewed the project as an economic opportunity and a reinforcement of security ties, others were uneasy about hosting a massive joint military installation. Environmental assessments, community impact, the symbolism of a visible and enduring expansion of U.S. military footprint north of the border. These debates gained traction. Political leaders facing both strategic calculations and domestic opinion had to weigh more than dollars and deterrence metrics. They had to consider perception, precedent, and political sustainability. In Washington, expectations had hardened in the opposite direction. The Trump administration presented the proposal as mutually beneficial job creation, technology sharing, enhanced deterrence in a rapidly shifting global security landscape. The administration's broader defense posture emphasized strength, forward positioning, and visible demonstrations of alliance solidarity. So when Canada declined, it was not treated as a routine policy difference. It was a disruption. Inside the White House, reports described urgency. Advisors debated whether diplomatic channels could reopen the discussion. Military planners reassessed strategic roadmaps that had assumed the base's existence. The cancellation forced immediate reconsideration of resource allocation and infrastructure planning. For President Trump personally, the rejection carried symbolic weight. His approach to alliances often centered on renegotiation, leverage, and visible wins. A publicly rejected initiative, particularly one framed as beneficial to both parties, cut against that narrative. It raised questions not only about the specific base, but about the broader method of pursuing partnership. Defense contractors felt the tremor almost instantly. A project of this magnitude would have generated contracts for construction firms, systems integrators, cybersecurity providers, logistics suppliers. Billions in anticipated procurement and infrastructure spending were suddenly off the table. Markets tied to defense and infrastructure saw fluctuations as investors recalculated future revenue projections. While the broader economy was not destabilized by the cancellation alone, The signal was unmistakable. Even among the closest allies, major defense initiatives are not guaranteed. International observers began asking harder questions. The United States and Canada are pillars of multiple global defense frameworks. Their coordination in intelligence sharing, airspace defense, and joint operations has long been considered seamless. A public disagreement over a $7 billion project did not erase that cooperation, but it exposed its complexity. Was this a sign that Canada sought greater strategic independence? Was it a tactical decision limited to one proposal? Or did it reflect deeper recalibration in how alliances are structured in the 21st century? Canadian officials were careful in their messaging. They emphasized that rejecting the base did not signal withdrawal from partnership. Joint exercises would continue. Intelligence collaboration would remain robust. Existing defense agreements stood intact. The message was not anti-alliance. It was pro-sovereignty. Supporters of the decision argued that true partnership requires voluntary alignment, not automatic expansion. They framed the rejection as an assertion that cooperation must align with national priorities rather than external expectations. In the United States, reaction divided along familiar lines. Some defense analysts described the move as a missed opportunity to strengthen continental defense architecture at a time of rising global competition. Others viewed it as a reminder that allies, even the closest ones, retain independent strategic calculus. Timing amplified the impact. Global security concerns have been intensifying. Nations are modernizing arsenals, investing in cyber defense, reassessing force posture. Against that backdrop, a canceled joint base, particularly one framed as cutting edge, took on additional symbolic weight. Media coverage reflected that gravity. Headlines emphasized the dollar figure. Panels debated sovereignty versus solidarity. Experts discussed whether this marked a turning point or a temporary divergence. Behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts accelerated. High-level communications sought to ensure that disagreement over one initiative did not spill into other areas of cooperation. Both governments have strong incentives to prevent escalation. Trade, border management, intelligence, Arctic policy all require sustained coordination. Military planners, pragmatic by necessity, began reassessing alternative models. Could expanded rotational deployments replace a permanent base? Could technology sharing continue without centralized infrastructure? Could joint exercises scale differently? Flexibility became the operative word. Public attention remained fixed on what this moment signaled about the broader trajectory of the alliance. Was North American defense entering a new phase one, less defined by permanent infrastructure and more by modular, flexible coordination? Or was this simply a recalibration driven by domestic politics and resource prioritization? As days passed, the initial shock gave way to analysis. Canada's decision demonstrated its willingness to assert national interest even within deeply integrated alliances. Washington's next steps would determine whether the episode hardened into friction or softened into adaptation. The broader lesson may be this: alliances are not static. They evolve. They respond to political currents, economic constraints, strategic reassessments. What appears seamless from a distance often contains layers of negotiation and recalibration beneath the surface. The $7 billion joint base will not be built. That is settled. But the story does not end there. The deeper narrative is about how two nations with intertwined histories and shared security commitments navigate disagreement without unraveling decades of trust. In an era defined by uncertainty, by shifting power balances, technological disruption, and renewed emphasis on sovereignty partnerships face new tests. The rejection of this proposal is one such test. For President Trump, it presents a challenge to recalibrate without escalation. For Canadian leadership, it affirms an approach that balances cooperation with autonomy. For global observers, it offers a case study in how even the strongest alliances must adapt to changing priorities. The immediate project may be gone, but the larger conversation about North American defense integration continues. It will unfold in policy reviews, in joint exercises, in quiet diplomatic exchanges far from public view. And that, ultimately, may be the enduring significance of this moment. Not the cancellation itself, but the demonstration that even among the closest allies, strategic alignment must be continuously negotiated. How that negotiation proceeds will shape not only defense planning, but the broader architecture of cooperation in a world where partnership and independence increasingly exist in tension. This was not just the rejection of a base. It was a statement about boundaries, about how sovereignty and solidarity coexist. And in the months ahead, The resilience of one of the world's most important bilateral relationships will be measured by how carefully and how constructively those boundaries are navigated. The fallout did not wait. Within hours of Canada's decisive rejection of the $7 billion joint military base, Washington's corridors of power were alive with urgent discussions, strategic recalculations, and, quietly, a growing sense of unease. The immediate political shock had settled into a longer, more complex reckoning, one that would test not only the mechanics of defense cooperation, but the trust, assumptions, and expectations that had long underpinned the U.S.-Canada alliance. Analysts described it as a moment of realignment, and they were not exaggerating. Inside the White House, advisors mapped out scenarios with surgical precision. Should the administration respond publicly with statements of concern, or maintain silence while pursuing back-channel negotiations? Could a scaled-down proposal salvage the strategic benefits initially envisioned, or would any attempt at compromise be interpreted as weakness? Each option carried tangible consequences, and each had the potential to reverberate across political, economic, and military spheres. The Trump administration faced a delicate balancing act: assert U.S. interests without alienating a key ally, signal resolve without escalating tension, and maintain credibility with domestic constituencies that had been promised bold action on defense matters. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Canadian officials appeared calm, almost impervious to the storm. Public statements underscored sovereignty, autonomy, and the national interest. But behind the scenes, planners and diplomats were fully aware of the broader pressures at play. They understood that rejecting the base did not dissolve the shared security architecture. Intelligence cooperation, NORAD commitments, Arctic patrols, and joint military exercises would continue. But the refusal served as a reminder economically, politically, and militarily that alignment does not require subordination. In financial markets, the immediate ripple effects were muted compared to a major trade dispute. Yet defense-linked equities and infrastructure investment portfolios felt tremors. Companies that had anticipated contracts for construction, advanced systems integration, and ongoing support now faced uncertainty. Analysts debated how the reallocation of resources might influence long-term defense procurement patterns. Would the U.S. pivot to alternative projects domestically or seek partnerships elsewhere? How would Canada's decision shape investor confidence in cross-border defense projects moving forward? For military planners, the cancellation was both disruption and opportunity. Without a permanent base, models of continental defense integration required adjustment. Could rotational deployments achieve similar operational readiness without the geopolitical and political complications of a fixed facility? Could digital infrastructure, shared command exercises, and coordinated training exercises be leveraged more efficiently? Strategists began considering more flexible frameworks, ones that emphasized adaptability over permanence, a lesson underscored by the sudden political realities that had just emerged. Across global defense communities, the incident was a topic of discussion and study. Other allies observed closely, noting that even among the closest partners, domestic political priorities can redefine international cooperation. The episode illustrated a broader truth in 21st century security. Alliance commitments are durable, but not immune to recalibration when national interest, sovereignty, or public perception come into play. The $7 billion base may have been the headline, but the underlying lesson was more profound. Strategic planning must anticipate not just technological or logistical challenges, but political contingencies and the evolving expectations of partner nations. In the United States, public and political reactions evolved over the days that followed. Supporters of the Trump administration emphasized the need to respect Canada's decision while signaling U.S. resolve. Critics questioned whether the rejection exposed vulnerabilities in negotiation strategy, alliance management, or broader defense planning. Congressional committees convened to assess potential impacts on continental security, while defense analysts weighed scenarios ranging from scaled-down alternative installations to expanded investments in domestic military infrastructure. The conversation was both immediate and long-term, because the implications extended far beyond a single base. Meanwhile, Canada began carefully positioning its narrative in the international arena. The government framed the decision as a strategic affirmation. Cooperation is welcome, but sovereignty is non-negotiable. Public messaging highlighted continued joint initiatives while asserting control over domestic defense infrastructure. By balancing reassurance with resolve, Ottawa sought to maintain credibility with allies, domestic constituencies, and global observers. Diplomats engaged quietly, ensuring that the rejection of the base did not bleed into broader bilateral tensions in trade, intelligence, or Arctic policy. As the initial shock settled, a new phase of dialogue emerged. Negotiators explored alternative frameworks for cooperation rotational deployments, shared operational planning, joint research initiatives, and interoperable command systems. While none carried the symbolic weight of a permanent $7 billion base, they offered paths forward that respected both nations' strategic imperatives. Flexibility became the watchword. How could two sovereign allies maximize shared security without compromising autonomy? For the broader public, the episode became a lens through which to examine the complexities of modern alliances. Media coverage emphasized not only the political drama, but the nuanced balancing act required to maintain cooperation amid independent decision-making. Citizens witnessed, in real time, the ways in which domestic priorities intersect with global obligations, and how perception, symbolism, and sovereignty converge in high-stakes security planning. Over time, markets adjusted. Defense contractors recalibrated projections. Investors sought stability in other sectors while monitoring future procurement plans. Governments in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere observed the unfolding dynamics, using the episode as a case study in alliance, resilience, negotiation, and the interplay between domestic politics and international cooperation. The final, enduring lesson of this confrontation was clear. Partnerships, no matter how long-standing or deeply integrated, require constant attention and adaptation. A rejection, even one as public and high-profile as Canada's refusal of the $7 billion base, is not necessarily a rupture. It is an inflection point. How leaders respond, how negotiators navigate competing priorities, and how institutions adapt to evolving political landscapes determines whether alliances endure, evolve, or fracture. For Trump, the moment tested political acumen, strategic patience, and diplomatic skill. For Canadian leadership, it reinforced the principle that sovereignty and cooperation are not mutually exclusive. For global observers, it provided a tangible illustration of the subtle and sometimes delicate forces that shape modern international security. Ultimately, the cancellation of the joint military base was not an endpoint. It was a transition, an evolution in North American defense collaboration that required recalibration, innovation, and renewed attention to shared objectives. In an era defined by rapid geopolitical change, technological disruption, and complex interdependence, the episode underscored a fundamental truth. Alliances endure not because of convenience or shared history alone, but because they can adapt, respond, and reaffirm commitments even amid disagreement. And as the weeks and months unfolded, the United States and Canada continued to navigate that balance carefully, deliberately, and with a recognition that strategic partnership is a living, evolving endeavor, tested as much by restraint and negotiation as by shared victories. The $7 billion proposal may have been rejected, but the relationship, tested and tempered, remained intact, perhaps stronger in its adaptability, more resilient in its acknowledgement of the interplay between collaboration and sovereignty, and profoundly instructive for a world where the only constant is change.